All right, good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today's national meeting session on advanced topics in body-worn camera technology. My name is Carrie Shelton and I'm the CNA Deputy Project Manager with BJ's Body-Worn Camera Training and Technical Assistance Program. As a reminder, points of view or opinions expressed today do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. And now I'm going to pass it off to our body-worn camera technology advisor, Elliot Harkeby, to facilitate the session. Elliot?
I want to start out by saying we want this to be an interactive session. There are a lot of directions that we can go with advanced technologies and advanced topics in technology, and we want to make this most valuable to you all as the participants. So feel free. In fact, we really would encourage you, if you have any questions at all, put them in the chat, raise your hand, let us know that you have a question so that we can address it as we go on. This is going to be very much an interactive session. My colleagues will introduce themselves. We'll go through a few high-level points to set the stage of things that we could talk about. But if you as the participants want to take it in a different direction, we're prepared to go any which way with this. So with that, I'll introduce myself. I'm the technology advisor for the Body-Worn Camera Training and Technical Assistance Program. And I've been working in this role for 4 years now and have gathered a fairly broad and deep understanding of the technologies around body-worn cameras in this role and in prior roles. I'd like to turn it over to Christian and Derek to quickly introduce themselves, and then we'll go into a few slides.
Thanks, Elliot. Good afternoon, all. My name is Christian Quinn. I'm an SME with CNA. I retired last year from the Fairfax County, Virginia Police Department as a major over the Cyber and Forensics Bureau. And in addition to some other projects that I oversaw, I handled the procurement process and operational implementation of our body-worn camera program. So thanks for being here.
And I'm Derek Meeks. I'm the Chief Information Officer for the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. Prior to this, I actually built and ran the MPD body-worn camera program as part of my technology advising to Chief Lanier. Elliot?
Just to give some boundaries into some of the things that we might be talking about, the things that could fall within advanced topics can include video analytics, and within that, there's all sorts of things, object recognition, all sorts of artificial intelligence, transcription technologies, which lead into natural language processing technologies, where they take that transcription and you look through the language to try and gather data or evidence or clues to where you should be looking for data or evidence. There's, of course, facial recognition, which has all sorts of strengths and controversies around it these days. There's another thing with all sorts of strengths and controversies are license plate readers. Vendors are now coming out with things that will help you write reports based on the BWC and all sorts of statistical analyses. There's all sorts of new features coming out every day. We've been hearing about the GPS tracking as well as the GPS tagging, using the cellular networks, live streaming, officer down technologies, shot detection technologies, linkages and interfaces with the CAD, with the RMS, with various other systems. And then there's the full digital evidence integration, which is integrating body-worn camera with all your other or certain aspects of other digital evidence, depending on how your agency is viewing that term. Redaction, of course, is always a big issue. Digital ethics and legal compliance are also major issues that we're very happy to talk about. But these are just a menu, and you can order off the menu if that's your choosing. So just wanted to set the stage before turning it over to Christian.
So as Elliot mentioned, just with respect to some of the things that are coming down the pike, one of the big ones that's being worked on right now is natural language processing. And natural language processing, I'll touch upon how it pertains to body-worn cameras or how it might. But first, just a quick foundational. This is tech that is not quite same as, but very similar to, if you've got an iPhone, the Siri function, if you've got another smartphone, Talk Assist, whether it's, Alexa or Google in your home. It's also when you call like a customer service line and the first thing you don't get is a human, and it's not a touch tone, but it's a voice automated one where it actually will interact with you to some extent and it'll look for keywords. So what's important to know is, when you see this work very well with your smartphone, it's in part because you set it up, it's user specific, and anyone who's ever set this up knows it walks you through, kind of like in the case of an iPhone, like that Hey Siri dictation, and it'll have you say a few things just to establish a baseline as to the response to your voice and your dialect. So where this is really really being forged ahead with respect to body-worn cameras is essentially there are vendors out there that are looking to isolate the audio stream within the footage. And this can be used in a variety of ways. If effective, the feeling is that most body-worn camera footage is never reviewed until there's something specific to look at. Either there's a complaint or a critical incident or those kind of things. But otherwise, you have a lot of data and a lot of information on what happens out in the field that just kind of sits on the shelf, the virtual shelf, if you will. And the aspiration for this technology is that by honing in on tone, sentiment, keywords, and things like that, that an agency would be able to identify either officers who are performing in an exemplary manner in de-escalating situations and giving good customer service, and those who might be finding their way into confrontations and things like that, that perhaps there's not a formal complaint generated, but it's leaving the community with a bad taste. So think of it almost as an early identification system. But with that, there's an enormous opportunity to realize efficiencies in terms of like looking at that kind of data at scale and maximizing the good that your agency is doing and being able to highlight positive things that your officers are doing or identify problematic things. Additionally, as an investigative tool, we can envision scenarios where if this works well, that officers might be interacting with witnesses or victims or just people in the area of an event and not really making note of specific nicknames or things that are said or something that is said in passing, or certainly not adding it to the report because they don't recognize that at that point that a specific word or utterance was of any evidentiary value. And we can envision detectives getting assigned cases going back and saying, show me every time like this key word or this nickname or what have you was uttered, and being able to hone in on specific instances where an officer might have interacted with a suspect or somebody else. Additionally, if you took that to the next level and were to marry natural language processing to automated dictation, we can envision scenarios where you could, in theory, auto-populate reports or auto-populate narratives and those sorts of things and extrapolate those kind of things out of the actual body-worn camera footage as opposed to ever putting fingers on a keyboard or anything of that nature. Touching upon that efficiently processing evidence, or more like expanding on that, many of you who already have programs know that one of the bigger challenges if you don't have CAD integration is officers manually tagging files or having files that end up being orphan files. And that, if you're a program administrator, this kind of keeps you up at night, especially if you have to comply with discovery and you have the threat of file that's out there that you risk purging because it's not married to a specific event. If you were to have natural language processing based on either the officer or the event or keywords or that sort of thing, you can envision a scenario where this might actually link a specific interaction to those files and do that for you. We can see it maybe even leveraging it for transcription and maybe even helping to facilitate discovery compliance, ensuring that when defense does a discovery order and your prosecuting attorney has to hand everything over, that nothing is missed. So some of the concerns that have already been expressed in just open source writing are concerns for bias, where certain race, ethnicity, certain dialects are either associated by way of the algorithm with like higher levels of toxicity or negative emotions, or that they're simply not accurately transcribed. There's some out there where the divergence is up to like 16% less effective with a non-white English speaker. So there's obvious concerns there that we're not going to equitably serve the community leveraging a tool like this. So that's something that has to be seriously considered, and the tech has to be perfected. And we have to really decide to what extent how accurate is accurate enough for use in the field. And then we're aware of similar technology being used against jail phone calls and things like that. But the challenge with body-worn cameras is you don't have a controlled sample where we know just the way video is a challenge in the field based on the constant movement and the fluid nature of officer usage, changes in background noise, changes in distance and proximity to a subject to the mic. Presumably, we're going to pick up the officer's audio pretty good if it's depending on the mount. We've heard about some of that in some of the other sessions today. But the subject that they're interacting with, depending on the distance and proximity, if it's raining out, these things all environmental factors can affect how well that audio is captured. It's just a few quick hits on natural language processing and the potential and the promise, but also the precautions.
Yeah, and I think, Christian, a quick note on that for the theater space. One of the really simple things we looked at was taking jail calls and trying to transcribe those. The prosecutors can read much more quickly than they can listen to, or for body cameras, watch and listen. And having the transcripts right in front of them gives them a much faster opportunity to zero in the things that are important. Through a couple of our experiments, we found that even with jail calls, which are reasonably good quality, we still really struggle to get high enough quality of transcription for it to really be a useful tool. So that, I think to your point, that quality of background environment is pretty critical.
And one of the things that we've talked about is dialectic differences. Wicked in the Northeast means a whole lot different than wicked in the Southeast. For that matter, trying to transcribe a deep Boston accent or a deep Maine accent versus a deep Southern accent poses its challenges. And every day, the transcription gets better. I've started to notice that the auto transcription on Zoom and Teams is actually now getting better than the professional transcription that's often used for people with disabilities. So it's getting better every day, but my opinion is it's not quite perfect yet. It's getting there, though. What are your thoughts?
I think we can envision early adopters having kind of a hybrid of it. We can imagine perhaps rather than pay a transcriptionist, maybe the first iteration of a transcription is automated, and then you have a professional transcriptionist go through it and fill in the blanks or make corrections that they're discovering because they're actively listening to it. And maybe through experimentation, they might even be able to listen to it at like 1.5 times the speed, because that's the value of a transcription, is being able to get through things quickly, being able to memorialize it. And we've talked about what constitutes best evidence. Presumably for court, the vast majority of the time, the body-worn camera footage itself is going to be your best evidence. But that's not to say that we still don't need, if we are submitting transcripts, if we're preserving that as a piece of evidence or just some kind of a historical record, accuracy is going to be paramount there. And I don't know that, like a lot of automated processes, to think we're going to continue to rely on that human in the loop to really make sure it's done correctly. What are your thoughts, Derek?
Oh, Christian, I agree with you. And I think one of the really interesting things with the notion of having a first pass be the system do the analysis and then a person sitting on top of that, one of the really neat things that people are starting to build into a lot of AI and machine learning these days is kind of the metadata of what's happening with the algorithm. And so you get confidence scores for the entire body of work, as well as at times even down to a single word or sound. That one imagines if a transcriptionist goes through all that, I think they could very quickly zero in on the words that have the lower confidence and make sure that their ear is actually picking up at what they're listening to. The other thing you and I discussed a little bit ago was systems that maybe will sit on top of the audio and at the first pass reduce the background noise, clean up the audio as much as possible, kind of sharpen it. We've seen this with a lot of pictures from back in the day. And then the second pass would be a system that's actually doing the transcription that would perhaps have a better, as a consequence, a better quality basis to work off of.
Just to add to that, it's an interesting thing is I think like many, I just came from the presentation on disclosure of body-worn camera footage, and Laura McElroy was discussing the production value of the footage that's released that's from certain agencies, and one notable being Los Angeles Police Department. And I'll have to follow up with a question on that, because my theory was you have just subset of the populace that there are probably a larger group of people out there who are just really good at video editing and really good at sound editing. So it does make me wonder to what extent those skill sets are going to come into release of body-worn camera footage. And maybe to your point, if we do have that layered approach where I work, a lot of times my technical surveillance detectives, technical investigation detectives would get tasks like that. Like, can you clean up a video? Can you clean up the audio on something? And I think increasingly, maybe that skill sets augments or makes way for a technology like natural language processing.
And there are definitely agencies that are hiring professional video editors and other video professionals to help them with the video release. So there's no question that's happening. And if not, hiring services to do that.
And the thing that I'm really waiting on, the kind of teetering on the precipice over this with, is seeing where's the line between edited so that it's fit for purpose in the courtroom versus, oops, we went a little too far, and that now has to be thrown out for whatever reasons.
Sure.
Like some of the legal boundaries, I'm not
sure. That gets into legal and ethics. That is actually a key issue, especially from the defense side. There definitely have been cases where videos have been intentionally mishandled, but there's also cases where if you're not using the proper software, to use the technical term codec, decoder, what looks like one thing may turn out to be another because it's not being done at the right speed and the right frame rate. And I've definitely heard specific examples where a video played on the wrong codec looks like an officer is assaulting a suspect, but when it's played back properly, it showed the officer saving the suspect who was falling and about to injure themselves. And making sure that you are using the right tools with the right analytics and not impacting the video is absolutely essential for making your case, and potentially doing the analytics to make sure that's correct could be essential to preserving your case. That is absolutely key, is making sure the right tools for the right job and that you are using the video properly.
And I did note that to the question I posed, Jason Lustig was just good enough to answer that. The Los Angeles DA's office actually posted a request at local film schools for video editing interns and did get a lot of responses. Use some of those for help with BWC editing.
One imagines that's a target-rich environment for that talent, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no
Thank you,
question
sir.
about that. And it's not just for the transcribers. I've been in meetings where I was the note taker and I turned on the closed captioning to get the transcript, which then I reviewed where I might have missed something and made sure first before I excerpted that made sense. What it captured was the logical, what actually was said and not a mistranscription.
Right. Well, one of the things, just right quick, and I think we'll hit on this more when we get into the video analytics as well. But and Christian, you touched on this, the sentiment analysis. I think that's interesting both for real time, police officer safety and things along those lines. I think it's also interesting for, as Christian said, in aggregate, when you're evaluating force, and then even in the prosecution space, to help kind of identify, again, what was happening in that scene and zeroing in on the details. And that's mirrored with the video analytics, where you're, Elliot, you were just describing a couple of variations there. Watching somebody's hand come in, is that an aggressive act, or is that something that's helping the person? What's happening there? And I think increasingly analytics, both sentiment analysis in audio as well as in some of the video things, that's where vendors are pushing towards. And they've often described that as to assist policy enforcement. And again, I think there's some time, but that may actually end up being something that we get to.
And the ability to manipulate the video is one reason why every one of these BWC systems locks the original video. You cannot touch the original video. You can only work on a copy. So if there ever is a question whether this video was manipulated or not, you can go back to the original video and see what was on the original video. So let's move on to the next, which is right in line with what we were just talking about.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick it off. I think one of the things, and this is video analytics in general, just if you look at where video analytics were 4 or 5 years ago versus where they've gotten to now, this is an area that has just made leaps and bounds. And when I think about video analytics independent of body-worn cameras, I kind of go back to the watershed moment of the Boston Marathon bombing, where there weren't a lot of systems at that time really existed. And there's been some great lectures and workshops on the things that had to be built at that time to really aid in that investigation. Once they had, you remember the brothers that one had a ball cap on, one had a backpack on. If something like that were to happen now, there are sufficient tools out there, and I'm not saying that they're all perfect, but where you can hone in on a ball cap, you can hone in on a backpack, you can hone in on sneakers and things like that, and really look at that video data at scale and look for things like that. And there's software platforms out there that will look at a retail theft and say, okay, show me when that article, whether it's a piece of jewelry or some other physical asset, disappeared. And the system itself can actually do that. Or you've got the ability to go back and do it on the front end, where there are systems that are so good now that there's a bit of AI tied into the video monitoring that will actually alert you to, okay, you set the parameters where certain days and times there shouldn't be activity. Or if there is somebody running through the frame as opposed to walking through it, it prompts the human user to take a closer look at it. Or if you see a vehicle driving somewhere where there shouldn't be a vehicle driving at certain dates and times. So it's just interesting how this field is emerging. But when we talk about that universal integration, we can imagine feeding our BWC footage, our in-car video, our closed circuit TV footage, our interview rooms, and you really, and what, privacy advocates worry about is kind of this coming God view, where essentially you can put all of this into one place and aggregate it and actually search it at scale, not using people. And I can tell you, having managed investigations from both the operational investigative standpoint and also from a personnel standpoint, in my own experience, we paid a lot of people, a lot of human beings overtime to sit in chairs and watch video and say, well, when somebody walked through the frame, or see if there's anything there. So there are serious efficiencies that can be realized there. But when you start coupling this with other existing technology, you do have to do that in a very thoughtful and deliberate way, because we heard that the remarks this morning that a lot of things are contextual, that what works in one community is simply not going to work in another community. And I think there's a lot of validity to acknowledging that we can learn from one another and take best practices from one another, but policing is still an extremely local activity. And we have to be very mindful of what our own communities will both embrace and what they'll tolerate and what they simply won't. So to what extent can we use all of these things at scale? It may simply be that, hey, our specific communities aren't ready for that, or they're simply not going to tolerate the capacity to search those things at scale. or we have to meet them in the middle somewhere and really do a good job of articulating how these things fit together. I do think it's going to be a long time before you see a tech tool like that integrated into body-worn cameras. And I think the same of biometric identification too. And we're going to touch upon it later in terms of legislation that specifically is aimed at this. But I don't think there's the capability nor the aspiration to be identifying people in real time off of body-worn cameras. But I do think there's a lot of utility to be able to do things on the back end with body-worn camera footage. I think it's one more tool in the toolbox when you start thinking about integrating multiple systems, when you start thinking about leveraging these advanced analytics to search across your platforms and look for things that are in common, because truly your officers out there are like sensors. They're taking in a lot of information, and we really can't necessarily expect them to appreciate the evidentiary value or the investigative value of every single thing that they see or every single person that they interact with at the time of, because so often those things and that activity is seemingly so benign without the benefit of hindsight. So very promising space, but also one that we need to approach pretty thoughtfully.
Well, I think that you're right that there's no desire on the police side and certainly no acceptance on the civilian side for the biometric identification in the cameras. But there are certainly countries in Asia and the Middle East that are doing that today. Now, I can't tell you what the level of accuracy is, but those are not necessarily what we would call free countries that are doing that. But the technology, some technology to do that exists today. But certainly it's not anything any U.S. agency wants to do, nor anything that any U.S. community will accept. To go back one point, you mentioned the Boston case, and I believe that had about 3,000 videos. Derek, am I wrong that you're working on a case that is now looking at some 14,000 reported videos? And how is that working in terms of the systems and the analytics?
Yeah, we have and I think that's been reported in the news pretty extensively, an extraordinary, literally unprecedented volume of content. And Elliot, unfortunately, I can't really get into too much of the investigative details there.
I don't want the details. I'm looking more for the technology and how that's working for you without going into the details about the specifics.
Yeah, understood. So the thing I can say about that is we did have an extraordinary amount of body camera footage that interestingly required that we have folks sit and watch and go through and categorize and inventory and essentially pull out some of the, not the metadata that you'd find about the video itself, who the officer was or, that, but more geographical location of the officer relative to other people and other things that were happening, stuff along those lines. From an analytics perspective, the interesting conversation there, and it's been a couple of years since I've talked to vendors about this in any detail because I haven't heard of anything that's made a change. Christian, perhaps but all the really, really cool analytic stuff has to do with fixed mount cameras, CCTV, and even if they're fisheye lens, the key thing that happens with them is the geometry of things that are happening in front of them all stays relatively the same, or at least changes in a consistent manner. One of the things that talking to vendors back in the day about the body cameras is that because the body camera might be moving at the same time that the subject, like you think about a car, if you think about a car on a fisheye lens, it's going to get larger and smaller as it comes towards you and then it goes away from you. If that's happening simultaneously to the person moving, the systems, as I understand it, have had a great deal of difficulty really successfully identifying any kind of objects in those terms. The thing I can tell you is I've talked with some vendors who are doing some interesting stuff, and they of course call all this object recognition. And we alluded to this a little bit. The details are they're starting to break people down by section of body, so legs versus torso versus head, and then they're able to apply specific algorithms to each of those individual sections, pull out a lot more of the detail, and therefore track that ball cap or track that scarf or whatever it happens to be. That's one of the things that I'm expecting, having some of the background in AI. That's one of the things I'm expecting is we'll see increasing layers of AI where you won't be aware of all the different layers that are in play and doing all the various analytics and feeding one another. Ultimately, just what you'll get at the back end is a really nice analytical package.
And I think one of the things that is going to make or break the AI, also making it a little harder now, but that will make things better in the future, are the data sets and the ability of that AI to learn along the way and learn from mismatches. But those mismatches need to be identified and fed back in. So it's literally a learning curve for the technology in addition to our learning curve on how to use the technology.
And one of the pieces, and this is getting totally geeky, I'm a technology guy, so here we are. But one of the things that might be interesting is when something gets seriously challenged in court, how did this thing identify that as being relevant? And how do you know it's really the same as that one? When you look particularly at neural nets, which are basically a simulation of the way the brain works, it's various nodes connected to one another. And all you know is that it works. Sometimes you know why. Sometimes you know why it's trained itself in order to be more effective. Being able to describe this and describe this in detail is a real challenge. And having just had to discuss with judges and defense attorneys things along the lines of that report got deleted because the officer didn't click the button, and that proving to occasionally be a challenge to articulate clearly. I think getting into the technical details of how algorithms work and that they're actually justified in what they've produced is going to be a serious struggle. So I don't know that we're in the ethical considerations here, but certainly from a policy perspective, that becomes a conversation point, I think.
And that's something that I'm not sure who would be that person to even be the expert witness to testify about it beyond the original algorithm writer, who there's probably one or two somewhere, some remote part of the country, cannot physically be at every court hearing. So I don't know how we do that. That's a very interesting question. All of these technologies are quite interesting. Are there barriers to acceptance from multiple perspectives? Barriers to law enforcement accepting it, barriers to prosecutors accepting it, barriers to communities accepting it?
If I may, I think one thing that we talked about in the past was looking at this through three different lenses: the real-time, the operational investigative, and then the prosecutorial. And the real-time is by far probably the most contentious. Both you guys have alluded to that. In some part, potentially, there's already a metaphor for this. License plate reader programs, what they do is scan every license plate that comes past it. And only if there is a corresponding license plate number on the hot list does the system react and provide a notification. In theory, you could do something similar with object or facial recognition, where at the edge of your cameras, onto your body cameras, if you were to have a face that were to hit on a corresponding hot list, interestingly, you might have a compromise that would allow you to satisfy the public's concern around privacy, and at the same time, be basically doing the same function that a police officer does when they recognize, hey, wait a second, that's the guy on the wanted sheet that I saw this morning. It's an interesting discussion. It's something that, from a policy perspective, I think is exactly the kind of thing that needs to be kicked around a lot before you could even start to have public discussions with it. But things I look for is parallels and metaphors. I think there are some interesting metaphors out there already. Christian, is that?
Yeah, and I think the other barrier that bears mentioning that is probably less of even a subjective discussion is just price. Your best stuff out there costs a lot. And I think sometimes these solutions are developed by really talented, really smart people, and the vendors or the companies themselves that develop them are simply not aware of what your typical public safety budget is going to be. And we won't name vendors, but we can think of certain vendors that got like one or two clients in the intelligence community because what they had was really good, but at a state and local level, you can't afford to implement it. So I think we have to be mindful of that too, that you opt something for the sake of checking a box and saying like, oh, this is a really neat shiny ball, if you will, that we saw at a conference. But the reality is really good stuff. Typically, until it's been out there for a long time, you have a lot of people competing in the space, and the price of this technology comes down. A lot of times when something good first comes to the market, it's a challenge to procure it simply because of the price point that it comes out at.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned both the price point and overhearing at a conference, because I was at a conference a couple of years ago that was sponsored by Department of Homeland Security. It turns out that one of the best performing facial recognition algorithms is actually available free from Department of Homeland Security. But if you don't know, one, that it's there, and two, the exact person to ask, it's not going to be available. And it's only available to law enforcement, and it's not available to the general public. But if you don't know that it's there and you don't know who to ask, you can't get it. So leapfrogging on the LPR just for a second, it's interesting how different states dealt with the data issue and the privacy issues with LPR. A number of states, including I think DC, decided the best way to protect people's privacy was to manage how long the data could be retained if it wasn't evidentiary. And a lot of debates in Virginia, I remember, whether that should be 7 days, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. And I'm not sure they ever came to a solution. Maryland took a completely different approach and said, if your concern is privacy and your concern is people accessing the data inappropriately, we are going to order the heck out of the request so that no inappropriate request can even go into the system. And should one ever get into the system, it will be reported all the way up to the governor. Now, that definitely had some downsides, as most individual agencies weren't able to effectively or cost effectively comply. So everything was turned over to the state police and the fusion center. But that also came to some advantages because they had a single unified statewide database. So it had some advantages, it had some disadvantages, but it was a completely different approach from what every other state was using. Another thing that came out of that was some exceptional reporting, and perhaps the only reporting that I've seen on the efficacy and impacts of LPR. It's an interesting comparison.
I was listening to the session on conducting pilots and evaluations this morning, and the topic of Charles posed the question, what would you have done differently? Or maybe knowing what you know now, what outcomes would you have wished for that you didn't have? And thankfully, the speakers on the panel all were kind of affirmed, like, hey, we ended up with a great program. But one of the comments was, if I had my way, we really liked one in-car video system, but we really liked one body-worn camera system, but we just realized we couldn't have two separate ones. And that really resonated. resonated with me because I remember, and I see Derek smiling as well, how you do come to that conclusion along the way that, you know what, we really cannot have two separate systems. It just creates a lot of challenges. It creates operational challenges at the officer level. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm just saying you acknowledge that it comes with a lot of challenges if you end up having that configuration where you have a camera that doesn't sync with a mic and you have two separate audio streams, or you have no mic, but now you have bifurcated video and it sits on a back-end solution that are in two different places that typically, if it's two vendors, they don't talk to each other. So if nobody ever points that out to you, you do finally realize, like, you know what, for better or worse, we kind of have to go with a single vendor if we're going to have both of these systems. Not that anything compels you to, but you tend to learn the hard way when you have two systems, as we did during our pilot, that it's rough at both an operational level and it's rough at a program management and administrative level. If you have an internal investigation and now you've got to search two systems that don't speak to each other to conduct criminal investigations. So it was kind of interesting to me that that sentiment was expressed this morning as something that they learned along the way, that they could have had it different in a perfect world, but we live that as well. And I think it kind of speaks to decisions that we make that really ultimately have nothing to do with the tech itself, per se, not the inherent nature of the tech, as we move along, and the downstream effect that that has on how we retain data, how we access data, who has access to it, and how we make policy decisions.
That's a fantastic point, Christian. I can tell you that I'm going to use the term patchwork quilt. I think for anybody who's coming into the body camera, for any police department that's coming into the body camera world now, I think the opportunities are actually better than back in the day.
Absolutely.
Because the market is really shaken out, and I think there's a couple core leaders, and you can have a comprehensive solution, and that makes life, as you say, so much easier. From the prosecution perspective, DC is a unique place, but I think we have something in the order of 35 different law enforcement agencies we potentially work with. Wow.
I think it's 144 was the last time I checked.
Look, headache. The answer is headache. The challenge, and of course, the systems that the office has, the storage systems, not to mention even the management systems that the office has put together to handle all this content and manage it, have not been completely seamless and integrated. And that's actually one of the things that I'm trying to get to, because not even with regard to video analytics and any of the kind of stuff that's really cool, just for the sake of the metadata and doing some of the higher level analysis and making sure that when we are producing discovery, we're truly producing everything that we're aware of, everything that we have. That alone is proving at times to be a challenge. So the whole data, metadata information that just sits around all this content, let alone the stuff that's contained within it. So it's tough. It's a tough environment, certainly.
And definitely one of those key uses for analytics that people want is, what about that officer who did not check into the scene on the CAD system to make sure that I have their body-worn camera, so the case doesn't get kicked because that officer shows up on someone else's video and the defense asks for the video that wasn't turned over from that officer who never checked into the CAD system.
And those kind of orphan files, that those automated processes that are coming along and they're becoming more routinely offered or just integrated into a system, those kind of systems can help with that quite a bit.
So, Christian, if I remember correctly, one of your great skills with Fairfax County was how to get a very concerned public to accept new and controversial technologies. What are some of the key tips for doing that? And I know you can turn this into a 2-hour presentation.
Because I will wholeheartedly admit, I had some of these that I absolutely got right, and I had some of these that I wish I could have done over again. I'll offer this, though. I think when it came to unmanned aerial systems, establishing a drone program, I really early on married data to anecdote to express, why do we need a new tool? What do we intend to do with it? I was extremely deliberate in declaring what the use cases were going to be up front. We were intentionally engaged with a lot of community stakeholders. At times it had that feeling like there were just too many cooks in the kitchen, but the end result was that county of well over 1 million people, when that went to public hearing, there was not a single person who came out in opposition of it. And really, if you don't open it up to all those stakeholders within reason, thoughtfully, you just don't know where that input's going to come from. And it might have been like the Audubon Society was worried about, how many more drones are going to be in the air and how that's going to affect people that are enthusiasts that want to watch the birds and are concerned with birds. What are the privacy concerns there? And some of our best policy considerations came from some of those voices of opposition where they said, hey, we don't want you recording all the time because we realize with your retention schedules, you're going to end up amassing a lot of data and you're not going to have the ability or the discretion to purge it, which was actually good with us. And it was actually helpful that came from privacy advocates. So we made the very conscious decision to have a posture of minimal data collection for that particular program. I don't see that working with body-worn cameras, but certain technologies, that's absolutely more appropriate because you're flying over people's yards, you're flying in proximity to apartment buildings and things like that. I think the other thing that we did specific with both body-worn cameras and some other ones were express prohibitions, like how are we going to use them around First Amendment activity? What are we going to do when an officer is engaged with someone who we've transported in for like either mental health services or a medical clearance, and healthcare staff are collecting HIPAA protected information? And you heard the chief say it this morning from Knoxville about having very defined instances when officers do turn the camera off and don't turn the camera off. And I saw in Laura McElroy's presentation that Sacramento had got into hot water after they released their footage because it wasn't clear when officers should be turning the mute function on their camera. And there was a legitimate reason why they had to after a critical incident. It was part and parcel of the policy, but all the public hears is turn your audio off, turn your audio off. And out of context, it looks like they're looking to conceal something. So I think it's labor intensive to go out and engage with people, but it's well worth the effort on the front end because you do get that feedback early on. It does help shape your policy in a meaningful way that's specific to your area and your community who you are delivering services to. And it allows you to declare on the front end, here's how the program's going to be. And sometimes to a larger extent, here's how it's not going to be. And not that you're looking to reach consensus, but you're at least allowing people the opportunity to be heard and having level set expectations at the start of a program.
But that's definitely some good thoughts to keep in mind. It's interesting you mentioned UAS because that's something that I probably should have added to this because at least two of the major BWC vendors, and perhaps all of them, are now trying to integrate UAS video into their data repositories. That is something where that video set is going to be merging with the body-worn camera and the in-car video set sometime soon if it hasn't already.
And candidly, it's a very natural evolution because it's just one more tool that yields video and one more thing that you have to retain data and retain evidence for, and everything that goes with one type of video that applies there applies to the other. It's just the vantage point and the method that it was collected.
We're almost out of time, but Christian, I know one of the other things that's in your area of expertise is tracking legislation. And how is legislation fitting into the advanced technology field these days?
I'm going to be super quick in the interest of time. Essentially, we see bills that, with respect to body-worn camera and facial recognition, that would ban an agency from having facial recognition integrated into a body-worn camera. I don't see that as a threat to any program because no one's really aspiring to do that in real time. The only thing I'd like to see preserved is if an officer is wearing a camera and they are incapacitated, harmed, killed, God forbid, and the last image on that camera is maybe the perpetrator, we need to have access to that video on the back end for examples like that where facial recognition technology might be the difference in terms of being able to identify that person. And then I think also along that line, there are instances where officers interact with people and don't know the value of the video that's going to be on that camera that may be on the back end. We want that. But otherwise, I don't see that being a challenge to programs. And if the federal government can't outright ban it, it tends to be tied to funding where you can't use federal funds for it, nor can you have a program and receive federal funding to sustain or establish one. Derek, anything that you've heard on your end?
No, Christian, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think the place that's interesting to us are some of the judicial decisions that affect detention and other things along those lines. In DC, we had an appellate decision recently that mandated that not only a video that was, and this was CCTV, but you assume that it works for body camera as well, ultimately, from an interpretive perspective. The CCTV of a particular incident, of course, had to be retained for the appropriate duration. But the court decided that even things that were tangential, and this came up because the defense said, if I'd had this video that was a block away from the incident, you'd see my client, and as a consequence, I'd be able to exonerate them very easily. State didn't keep that. And so on appeal, the court overturned that and said, no, not only do you have to keep the things that are specifically of the incident itself, but also those that are in an area. And that drives up costs, that drives up all sorts of extraordinary things. So I think that is kind of the overall comment I'd have in the judicial space is a lot of this stuff is still people figuring out what the precedents are going to be and how they're going to actually stick. So I'm attempting to be terse myself in the interest of time and, probably failing miserably, but.
Okay, and the slide we skipped over was digital ethics, but a lot of this was the stuff that we talked about with how to prepare a community to accept new technologies. So you want to say a couple of words about this, Christian, as well?
I think the two things that really cross over outside of what I already touched upon with respect to community engagement are the theme of data. How long is data retained? Who has access to it? What are your cybersecurity parameters around it? Because you look at the sensitive nature of this, it really does have to go someplace where it cannot be penetrated, it cannot be breached, and it can't get out there. Then just generally those themes of data privacy, because I think independent of anything public safety is doing, Congress is taking a much greater interest in consumer rights and the ability to opt out, the ability to regulate what's collected, how long it's retained, that sort of thing. So look for some of that to trickle over into how public safety is able to maintain data as well that's not an evidentiary value or directly related to a court process.
Do we have any additional questions from participants?
Okay, I see a question. For a state like North Carolina, where it's more difficult for external entities to obtain video data without court order, our agency has not invested in video redacting tools or editing at all. The vendor provided integrated redaction tool is poor, so we currently have no good method. Is there a best practice for redaction or recommended tools that are widely accepted and help maintain the integrity of digital evidence? I'm concerned that when video evidence is captured, where individuals such as juveniles must be redacted efficiently, we are just not there. So any comments?
Derek, you played with some of that stuff.
Yeah, back with MPD, again, this is a couple of years ago, we had a variety of different vendors that wanted to sell redaction tools. And the notion of this was tools that would allow a person to effectively redact versus tools that would have some manner of AI, what have you, and get you part of the way there versus the holy grail that were touted to do all of the redactions for you. Those are vaporware. We didn't find one that actually performed and would seamlessly redact everything that you'd want to redact, this being license plates, addresses, faces, things along those lines. And in fact, with some of the tools, we found that skin tone actually made a difference in how effective some of those automated redacting tools were. Ultimately, the place that we got to was still using people to use some of the industry state tools in order to do those redactions. My hope is that in the near future, and this is kind of like what we're talking about, Christian, with the natural language processing, my hope is that those tools will get you to a point where you'll get a pretty good job done, and then it'll take a human to carry the final step. The challenge there is that in some of the AI tools that I remember seeing back in the day, it would redact everything except for 1 or 2 frames. And as a human being, that's going to be tough to pick up on those 1 or 2 frames that are missing. You might inadvertently leave them, and then somebody could pick up that video and actually see the person's face for those 1 or 2 frames without the redaction.
Same experience.
Yeah, and that's the difference between, are you turning over the video or are you letting them view the video with you? If you're letting them view the video with you, they're not going to see those 1 or 2 frames. But if you're turning over the video, they can certainly scan for those 1 or 2 frames.
Absolutely.
But even if it's just 1 or 2 frames, if you go through it frame by frame and just to look for those 1 or 2 frames, that's still a lot less labor than having to go frame by frame to look at every frame and redact every frame. So the automated software still gets you much further along.
The one thing I would recommend, and I appreciate that it was an IT systems manager that asked, so they'll understand this. If you're going to buy something, try to get something that interacts effectively with the native content. In my bureau, we did do some things where we basically were doing like an overlay. We're creating another layer and either pixelating or black blocking what needed to be redacted on top of that. And that ended up creating a lot of issues for us downstream. But at the time, it was kind of like the best thing we could make do with given the circumstances, because our particular in-car video at the time, on camera, the tool was more as Derek described. But our in-car video we had a lot of issues with because we couldn't access the codec, so we had to do something on top of the footage. But there at least is some better stuff out there. And you know, Derek's point, typically the automated tools get you part of the way, but we still found that we had to still touch it in the interest of being thorough, especially if it was something that we were compelled to release.
Oh, I know that we can continue for a while, and I think that a majority of the 30 people still with us would like us to continue for a little bit, but it is time for the closing session.
All right. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so very much.